This is a new area of inquiry for this lecture series, which has normally been on the history of Atlanta architects. And our hope is that the topic tonight has attracted a few new faces, people that are members of garden clubs, and I understand a few of you are on your way to England in a week or two or a month or two or whatever, so that's very good, yes? And this is always a bit problematic. I'll get as close as I can. I should say that I'm an historian and I'm not a master gardener. So don't ask me what grows in full sunlight in Atlanta, because I'm likely to say very little in August. I've divided the talk tonight in three parts, and the idea of a world image garden is going to suggest that we are going to take a world tour of gardens before we get to Biddulph Grange, and then we'll take an armchair tour of Biddulph Grange itself. But the first section is Biddulph Grange in the context of the history of the English garden and its counterparts on the continent. And the second, a focus on the aesthetic background of two of Biddulph's unusual features, garden areas that are called Egypt and another called China. What is the background to this unusual interest at Biddulph in China and Egypt as opposed to classical Rome? And finally, a visual armchair tour of the garden itself. Like many of you, when it comes to the history of English gardens, the names that first come to mind are 18th century Stourhead and Stowe, seen here adorned with neoclassical and neo-gothic follies, or perhaps early 20th century Chisenhurst in Kent on the top right, or Hidcote in the bottom right, or Hestercombe by Edwin Lutyens at left. The names of the gardeners who created these masterpieces of landscape are familiar. Henry Hoare, who owned the Anglo-Palladian house at Stourhead and created its gardens. Charles Bridgman and John Vanbrook and William Kent and Lancelot Capability Brown, who worked successfully at Stowe between 1731 and 1751. And Vita Sackville West and Harold Nicholson, who created Chisenhurst between 1930 and 1968, and that masterful partnership of Gertrude Jekyll and Edwin Lutyens, whose designs were once called Gardens of a Golden Afternoon. Lutyens and Jekyll were masters of the arts and crafts gardens, with Lutyens designing the hardscape and architectural elements, and Jekyll selecting the plantings. Hestercombe in Somerset, one of their best-known collaborations, displays Lutyens' geometric frame for Jekyll's impressionistic plantings. But none of these garden designers had anything to do with Biddulph Grange, which in date falls between the informal 18th century gardens of Stourhead and Capability Brown, who, by the way, is said to have re-landscaped the entirety of England during his lifetime, and the Lutyens-Jekyll partnership. And much as Stowe differs from Hestercombe and Chisenhurst, Biddulph Grange differs from all three. The 18th century so-called classical informal garden, English garden, was populated with classical temples and follies. And it might be noted that Stowe was owned by the Temple family, whose family motto was Templa quam delecta, how beautiful are thy temples. At Stowe, the Temples built dozens of temples, obelisks, triumphal arches, and commemorative columns. The early 18th century is also known as the Anglo-Palladian period, when in 1736-7 a Palladian bridge was built for the 9th Earl of Pembroke at Wilton, thought to be his own design. It was copied at Stowe, copied again at Prior Park in England, and even in the Empress Catherine's palace in Russia. Although I've photographed all of these Palladian bridges during various travels, I selected 3 images online as particularly picturesque, but I couldn't resist showing you on the bottom right my own telephotoed image from across the vast lake of the grounds of the Empress Catherine's palace outside Petersburg. It may be a while before Russia welcomes American tourists again. By the way, it was in Russia that Carol and I first met Dawn and Paul Mowry from Sarasota, Florida, who are here tonight. They hold the record for traveling the longest distance to attend a DeKalb History Center event. I would have laid money on a bet that the Palladian Bridge at Zarkayo Selo was designed by Empress Catherine's Scottish architect, Charles Cameron. Why else would a popular Anglo-Palladian garden feature appear in a Russian garden? British historian Howard Colvin has written that at Zarkayo Selo, Cameron produced, quote, some of the most exquisitely elegant neoclassical interiors in 18th century Europe. The Empress Catherine wanted the neoclassical style to become the new imperial style, much as Marie Antoinette wanted the same thing in France. And it would be a safe bet that Cameron had provided Catherine with her Palladian bridge to adorn her garden. However, I would have lost the bet. And I'm going to read what's underneath because I know you can't read it. The so-called marble bridge at St. Petersburg was built from a model made by Vasily Nyailov in the early 1770s. Craftsmen at the lapidary works under the supervision of Valerio Tortorelli cut from local blue-grade Gornitschitsky and white Stanovsky marble columns, capitals, pedestals, balustrades, and other elements to the patterns provided. The panels to face the abutments of the bridge were made from gray pink granite. The foundations for the marble bridge were laid in 1773. In 1774, the bridge was assembled on site by Valerio Tortori and his assistants Ivanov, Grigoriev, Petrovsky, and Shakhurin. 5 years later, in 1779, Empress Catherine invited Scottish architect Charles Cameron to St. Petersburg, where he executed for Catherine numerous commissions in her garden and elsewhere in St. Petersburg, and remained in Russia until his death in 1812. But the Palladian Bridge, the latest of the four known Palladian bridges, is not his. 100 years before Biddulph, the 18th century witnessed the creation and widespread influence of Le Jardin à l'Anglaise, the classic English garden. For generations in the 18th century, the informal English garden set the tone for estates of aristocratic gentlemen to the grounds of European royalty, with influence extending from Empress Catherine's royal residence at Zarkayo Selo near St. Petersburg to Marie Antoinette's hameau at Versailles. And if we return to Stowe for a moment, on the top right corner, well, in fact, first the bottom left, we note that among the garden's numerous classical temples was James Gibbs's Gothic Folly of 1741. And at Stourhead, Henry Hoare built a small Gothic garden cottage, which is at the top right, fit for a hermit, who's at the bottom right. In fact, Sir Henry hired a hermit to occupy the cottage and to appear periodically to the delight of garden visitors. At Stourhead, guests would wander around the lake, the cottage, and the hermit, like the classical follies, was merely another enrichment of the perambulation. Hired hermits, by the way, were instructed never to shave nor ever to imbibe alcohol. You do not want a drunken hermit to walk out of that cottage. His surprise appearance was not unlike Marie Antoinette's dressing up as a milkmaid and wandering around her own little hamlet at Versailles at the top left to give the impression she was one of the common people. But it was not so much hermits as classical temples and follies that mostly populated 18th century English gardens. Inspired by monuments and artifacts aristocratic English estate owners observed on their grand tour to Italy. This was the classic image of the 18th century English garden. However, there is not a single classical temple or folly at Biddulph Grange. Biddulph's owner, James Bateman, had a passion for plants, not a passion for architecture. And the collections displayed at Biddulph are exotic plants collected from around the world, not ancient or Gothic follies. So what attracted me to Biddulph? In part, I was curious about garden development in the years between the Georgian era of Capability Brown and the Edwardian era of Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll. Historically, the era between the Hanoverian Georgians and the 20th century gardeners is generally known as the Victorian age. And my impression of Victorian gardens and parks is they too often looked like they were embroidered with geometric arrangements of annuals and garish parterres, and designs really were more akin to embroidery and to carpet patterns. In the end, Victorian gardens, just prior to and contemporary with Biddulph, looked back to Fouquet at Vaux-le-Vicomte and Lenôtre at Versailles, not to England's own heritage of informal landscapes. But Biddulph Grange did neither. There are differences in scale as well, and a comparison of the size of some of Europe's noted gardens is also of interest. Let's start with the 17th century in France. Vaux-le-Vicomte, 100 acres, a formal layout of unprecedented grandeur that ended up landing the owner, Fouquet, in jail, partly from Louis XIV's jealousy, but it might have had something to do that Fouquet was his finance minister. Now, it happens that history has suggested there wasn't anything particularly undercover for the money he spent here, but Louis was outraged that what Levaux, the architect, and Lebrun, the painter, and Lenôtre, the architect, the landscape architect he created, was well beyond anything France had ever seen. So Versailles needed to do one better. That garden is 1,976 acres. That's only 19, almost 20 times as large as Vaux-le-Vicomte. It is Louis XIV's Baroque masterpiece. And it emulates with this major axis that goes to the very horizon, about 2.5 miles from the palace, and a huge cross axis that if you look at the plans of Versailles at the top and the plans of Washington, D.C. at the bottom, you can see how much the layout by Charles L'Enfant was influenced by the gardens of Versailles. The Capitol is where the palace was. The long canal goes to the Washington Monument. The cross axis leads up to the White House. It eventually continues on even further to the horizon at the Lincoln Memorial and then turns down at the counter cross opposite the White House to the Jefferson Memorial. But this garden, Versailles, was nearly 2,000 acres. Courts all over the continent began to emulate these layouts, and at Würzburg, Germany, it was only 11 acres because the city fortifications kind of squeezed the palace within a certain area, but they still looked to parterres and cross axes and various things, ultimately looking to Versailles. On almost the scale of Versailles is the Schönberg Palace in Vienna, but it's only 460 acres compared to nearly 2,000, but certainly has the sense of the scale of Versailles. And in St. Petersburg, Russia, at the Tsarskoye Selo, the whole complex is 1,000 acres. That town, by the way, is known as the Tsar's Village. It's now called Pushkin. And at Empress Catherine's palace, her Parc à la Anglaise around the large lake measures about 300 acres. All of these are fairly substantial. There's the lake and the English garden that Catherine designed for her Baroque palace, and the view across the lake. This looks like it could be at Stowe or at Stourhead, but it's in St. Petersburg looking at Cameron's building across the lake. If we go back to England and consider Stourhead, the whole estate is about 1,000 acres. The whole estate is about 2,650 acres, so it was huge, but the garden itself is about 1,000 acres. And Stowe, on the right, is about 880 acres. We work more toward the English 20th century. Hestercombe at the right is 10 acres. Hidcote in the middle is 10 acres. And Cisenhurst on the left is about 12.5 acres. So suddenly the flower garden of the 20th century has shrunk considerably. And then at the bottom is Biddulph Grange, 15 acres, right in the context of those smaller later 20th century. Now, I've walked the grounds of all of these gardens, and from the point of view of scale, the last four are comparable in size: Sissinghurst, Hidcote, Hestercombe, and Biddulph Grange. And while the first three are small and seem so, Biddulph Grange takes its cue from classical Chinese gardens, which in Suzhou are also small, but don't appear to be small. How to make a small garden appear large informed my observations when I went to China to study Chinese gardens, and again when I visited Biddulph Grange. Biddulph was also a matter of curiosity because the garden was completely lost when the house was converted to a hospital, and then the garden was rediscovered and reconstructed. It was the largest reclamation project on the garden branch of the National Trust in England at the time it was reclaimed. So the same summer that I arranged to visit 19th century Highclere Castle, not knowing that Highclere would soon become Downton Abbey, I sought out its almost exact contemporary, Biddulph Grange, that mysterious garden in Staffordshire that for years I had never heard of, and the gardens did not disappoint. So that's part one, and this is about the context in Europe. Now, I've used this term, the world image garden, and so I want to talk a little bit about some of its features with respect to its ancestors, contemporaries, the Victorian global view, certainly, but the character of where these influences from particularly Egypt and China came from. 19th century England gives evidence of an expanded global view that resulted from travel to and explorations of the far corners of the world. It was the great era of the British Empire, and that brought distant worlds into English consciousness and daily life through artistic imagery, collected artifacts, including foreign plants, and expropriated ideas. Landmark instances of this worldview are familiar in both architecture and garden design, and of particular popularity in the middle of the century were the fine arts courts of the rebuilt Crystal Palace, the enlarged exhibition hall re-erected in 1853 at Sydenham, this is about 10 years before Biddulph, where architects Matthew Digby Wyatt and Owen Jones brought to the masses spectacular reproductions of art and architecture of various historic periods and international settings, including elaborate courts identified as the Egyptian court, the Assyrian court that they called Nineveh, a Greek court, Byzantine, medieval, the Alhambra, Pompeian, Italian, Renaissance court. You can see some of that variety on the screen. Extending this worldview to gardening, Joseph Paxton and others sponsored worldwide expeditions for the collection of exotic plants, bringing back to England previously unknown species that they were able to keep alive in Wardian cases. This was not earlier possible. They could only bring seeds back, but they could actually have the plants themselves that were in these primitive terrariums. And then they cultivated hybrids in the new iron and glass greenhouses at Chatsworth, Kew, and elsewhere. James Bateman was a student at Oxford when he sent Thomas Coley to collect orchids for him in British Guiana. With roots in the collecting habits of 18th century connoisseurs and antiquarians, Victorians acquired decorative arts to ornament their country house interiors and gathered foreign and native plants to decorate their gardens, which were further enriched by monuments and follies dressed in historic and international styles of architecture, which by the 19th century were broader in scope and expression than the prevailing classicism of 18th century garden structures. Especially notable as a reflection of this expanded worldview is our focus tonight, the garden at Biddulph. It was created from 1842 to around 1865 as perhaps the quintessential example of the mid-Victorian world image garden. Biddulph transported visitors on a global journey from Italy to the pyramids of Egypt and from a Victorian vision of China to a recreation of a Himalayan glen. So part two of the talk tonight presents Biddulph Grange as a reflection of its owner, James Bateman's worldview, manifested in his interest in exotic plants as both author and collector, but most notably in his role as a creator of a mid-Victorian garden of episodic settings referencing international culture, notably Italy, Egypt, and China. Bateman's orchestrated ensemble of scenographic garden vignettes, what the National Trust has called Biddulph's horticultural adventure of discovery, consciously avoided the aesthetic of previous generations, both the geometric formalities of grouped parterres and axes and vistas, as well as the vast open lawns and classical follies of Capability Brown's open 18th century landscapes. All this in favor of garden rooms of individualized character. At Biddulph, at its sloping site, changing levels bound by retaining walls and terraces near the house, as well as the fern-covered banks and hedges and lime trees and pine avenues and rockwork, define garden areas deeper within the grounds. Paths through tunnels, archaic gates, high trails and glens, and rustic woodlands, all marked by distinctive groupings of exotic and rare plants, lead from one garden region to the next. On the other hand, Biddulph Grange, like earlier English natural gardens, is designed to look as though it was not designed at all, other than how perhaps a painter might organize a composition. While carefully choreographing visitor experiences to evoke purposeful emotional responses, Biddulph's designers here significantly employed a vocabulary more international in spirit and form than is found in classical English gardens. And notwithstanding the non-classical focus of Biddulph's garden ornaments and follies in areas of the garden called China or Egypt, for example, some landscape discoveries are not unlike the experience of a perambulator at Stourhead, now on the screen, who happens upon a path leading into a grotto from which a panoramic tableau of the garden, lake, the temple of Flora, the bridge, and the village beyond is framed by the grotto opening as in a painting. Parts of Biddulph Grange are comparable, set pieces, but what makes this garden unique is the ever-changing world imagery from region to region. At Biddulph Grange, archaic gates, tunnels, and pyramid topiary, flanked by sphinxes, dense glens and open vistas, and sequential scenes of recognizably international character, promote evocative passage through one's imagination to foreign cultures. Now, moving beyond the dominance of classical garden ornament at such 18th century English gardens as Stourhead or Stowe, the worldview of James Bateman created a garden that offers visitors a surrogate, what we may call an armchair tour, of geographically distant cultures, habitats, and horticultural experiences. In the worlds of Renaissance Italy, ancient Egypt, exotic China, they're all distinct. And Bateman's collections of azaleas and rhododendrons around the lake, dahlias along the Dahlia Walk, lime trees along the Lime Avenue, conifers including cedars, pines, and redwoods, as well as monkey puzzle trees in the Pinetum, and the world's first stumpery. All these conspire to create a variety of horticultural and botanical content as well as visitor response. Beyond their awareness of planned irregularity, these distinct garden rooms and composed painterly scenes and perambulations, playing the role of a participating audience in Bateman's theater, experience such emotions and sensations as mystery and intrigue, surprise and irony, and even engaging anticipation and curiosity engendered by the garden's variety of scene changes. While gardeners of the previous century looked to the ancient past of classical Rome, James Bateman's vision extended from Egypt to China in his gardens, and from Guatemala to Mexico in his horticultural scholarship. So I want to take a look at two of these especially. What's the background to Biddulph Grange with respect to England's fascination with China and chinoiserie in the years preceding this garden? England's worldly aesthetic interest in China in particular were revealed early by the embracing of 18th century chinoiserie and decorative arts. This Chinese taste, a century before Bateman's time, ranged from Chinese influence on Chippendale furniture and the contemporary wood carvings and elaborate plasterwork of the late 1750s to 60s by Luke Lightfoot at Claydon House, a country house in Buckinghamshire, all the way to isolated Chinese pavilions adorning English gardens and to more widespread popular imagery such as scenes in Chinese blue and white export porcelain displayed in these late 18th and 19th century residences. Now, I can't drop the name of Luke Lightfoot and Claydon House without showing you what might be the wildest assemblage of chinoiserie, or should I say Rococo chinoiserie in England. Claydon House was built from 1757 to 71 as the Anglo-Palladian movement was about to give way to the influence of Robert Adam and a more delicate neoclassicism. So the salons at Claydon were organized symmetrically with classical doors flanked with round-headed arches, classical friezes, and broken pediments over the doors. But look at that ornament. Rococo surrounds, carved birds capping bursts of Rococo foliage, and pediments flaring like a Chinese temple roof. Luke Lightfoot decorated mantelpieces, door surrounds, and gilt mirrors with a mixture of Chinese motifs and Rococo icing that would make a confectionery jealous. Rococo is rarely seen in England, but it's certainly in evidence here. However, it is the Chinese taste that dominates, bringing chinoiserie out of its realm of collectible decorative arts fully into architecture. And nowhere is it more resplendent than at Claydon House in the seating niche that Luke Lightfoot created his masterpiece of carving and stucco work. Now, English awareness of China was likely first in evidence through missionary reports, probably notably accounts of Jesuit missionaries active in China in the 17th century, and reinforced by such works as the translation of the General History of China in 1738 by the French Jesuit priest Jean-Baptiste de Halde. In addition, imported goods from China introduced to the English white porcelain with blue decorative motifs, cabinets ornamented with scenes of irregular mountainous landscapes and lakes, and scenes from landscape paintings depicting natural settings distinctly different from those regularized and formal geometries shaping contemporary Western gardens. The naturalism, perceived lack of geometric order of the Chinese garden, and the images of landscapes depicted in Chinese paintings influenced the development of the 18th century informal English garden. In 1685, Sir William Temple, an English ambassador to The Hague, wrote an essay entitled Upon the Gardens of Epicurus, in which he criticized the formality of European gardens with their straight lines and neat rows of clipped hedges as designs that any boy could create, as he wrote, praising instead the irregularities and asymmetries appreciated by the East Asians, although Temple had never visited China. Temple employed the term Sarawaji in discussing the Chinese idea of beauty without order in garden design. Much as English chinoiserie appears to merge with the more organic continental Rococo in such interior plasterwork and decorative arts as at Claydon House, mentioned above, so the organic character and naturalistic appearance of Chinese gardens influenced English interpretations of natural landscapes to create the irregular and the picturesque typical English landscape. One of the first English architects to travel to China was the Swedish-born William Chambers, who sailed with the Swedish East India Company in 1740 to 49, and upon his return published a book called Designs for Chinese Buildings, Furniture, Dresses, Machines, and Utensils. And 2 years later, Designs for Chinese Buildings with a treatise on civil architecture. These were the first serious attempts to record the architecture and decorative arts of exotic China. And Chambers immediately concretized his New World view by building a series of exotic structures at Kew, which is the Royal Botanical Garden outside of London. In 1757, he was commissioned to design the grounds at Kew of the House of the Dowager Princess of Wales, known as the White House, drawing inspiration from his travel. Chambers erected an Alhambra, a Moorish mosque, a 163-foot tall Chinese pagoda, which is what we're looking at on this screen now. The latter influenced by prints that Chambers had seen of the porcelain pagoda at Nanjing, which was a 15th century Ming Dynasty pagoda. Some Chinese tea houses and pavilions had already appeared in English gardens prior to Chambers' published designs. The Chinese house at Shugborough in Staffordshire, as an example, said to be based on a building in Canton. And while the Chinese house at Richard Temple's Stowe Garden is even earlier, around 1738. Indeed, the Stowe Pavilion, which is attributed to William Kemp, is considered the oldest surviving pseudo-Chinese garden pavilion in Britain. It's had its permutations, though, all over England. The pavilion at Stowe, first mentioned by an anonymous visitor in 1738, is shown in a 1750 engraving views of the temples and other ornamental buildings of the Garden of Stowe, illustrating a small rectangular exotic pavilion which sat on a base supported by piles driven into the bed of a pond. The pond no longer exists. A footbridge adorned with Chinese vases with flowers to them led to the pavilion, which had lattices on each side and two dolphins at either end of the gable ridge pole of a pseudo-gambrel roof. The pavilion's wall surfaces were painted with chinoiserie decorated by Francesco Sleater, although later repainted over. Contemporary descriptions suggest that the interior may have been decorated with East Asian lacquer panels. Models of Chinese ducks floated in the pond, and a statue or mannequin of a sleeping Chinese woman occupied the pavilion interior. All that describes what it looked like when it was originally set in a pond at Stowe. And none of these pseudo-Chinese adornments survive. About 1751, the Chinese pavilion at Stowe was moved to Wootton House, at first sited on an island there, but later moved to nearer the country house. Finally, after at least two intermediary repaintings, the pavilion received its current decoration scheme about 1820 by an unknown artist who worked in the style of chinoiserie decoration that was related to the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. Stowe's new Chinese house decoration consisted of cartouches with Chinese characters that were based on characters from two plates out of William Chambers' designs of Chinese buildings that I mentioned before. Vases and planters, bowls with flowers, dragons, Buddha figures, and ladies in landscape on the building's exterior with cartouches with pseudo-lacquer work and images of Chinese deities on the interior. In 1957, the Stowe Chinese was shipped from Wootton House to County Kildare in Ireland, but it was finally repatriated to Stowe in 1993 after the National Trust acquired the gardens at Stowe in 1989. The Chinese house was then resited near the Palladian Bridge at Stowe, which was not its original site, and it was unveiled to the public in 1998. So it's only been the last quarter century that this pavilion, the oldest in England, has been able to be viewed at Stowe. Throughout its moves, the pavilion remained an isolated folly with no English garden context or setting. It was just sort of plopped in the middle of the grounds. It joined the other Stowe follies, cited simply as architectural objects in an eclectic collection, which at Stowe is comprised of a Gothic pavilion, classical temples, a monumental triumphal arch transplanted to an open landscape, various classical monuments mostly, but many replete with political symbolism or literary content, as most legible at the Temple of British Worthies that is there at Stowe by Kent. Now, directly linked to Chambers and his publication, although via an even more circuitous route, is Cliveden's Chinese Ting-type garden pavilion, known as the Cliveden or Cliveden Pagoda. It's a copy of a pavilion erected in the 1780s in the garden of the Chateau of Romainville near Paris, That Romanville pavilion was based on a pavilion design from Chambers in his 1757 design of Chinese buildings. The copy of the Chambers Romanville pavilion later was bought by the first Viscount Astor, who we better known as William Waldorf Astor, was originally displayed at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1867 and then was purchased by the Marquis of Hereford and erected in the garden of his Paris residence, the Bagatelle, in the Bois de Boulogne. Finally, in 1900, Astor bought the Chinese ornamental pavilion for his new water garden at Cliveden. Cliveden is now a five-star hotel outside of London, but the house and the gardens are still there. And also based on Chambers was the chinoiserie work of Scottish architect Charles Cameron in St. Petersburg. He was invited, as I noted, to Russia to work for the court of the Empress Catherine. Almost immediately after his arrival in St. Petersburg in 1779, Catherine put her young British architect to work on her own Chinese village. Wanting her own collection of chinoiserie, Catherine showed Cameron a painting in her art collection and set him to work to adorn her gardens with houses in a Chinese village. He designed a series of houses and pavilions, and based on this drawing that was later made, there seemed also to be a Chinese theater as part of this complex. And in addition, Cameron designed several Chinese bridges that crossed the small streams in the park, flanking both her palace and the Alexander Palace adjacent. This is the large Chinese bridge. It's not large at all, but it's larger than the two other Chinese bridges, so they call this one the large one. And then there are two others, this one adorned with urns, decorative twigs, and Chinese figurines, and the smaller Chinese bridges are accented with exotic pavilions. Well, the most famous high-style exercise in chinoiserie in England during the late 18th and early 19th century was, of course, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, a small lodge converted by Henry Holland into a relatively modest marine pavilion, and then further expanded and redesigned in 1815 to 1823, that's about 20 years before Biddulph, by John Nash to create an extravagant pleasure palace for the Prince of Wales, who later became George IV. This was royal chinoiserie on a royal budget, and the expense involved in this just blows your mind. By his mid-20s, the Prince of Wales was heavily in debt, despite receiving from Parliament at age 21 a grant of £60,000. In today's money, that is £7,685,000. And an annual income from the king of another £50,000, another £6 million in today's money, that only further enabled him to continue his profligate lifestyle, heavy drinking, and wildly extravagant expenditures, including at the Royal Pavilion. In 1787, Parliament's House of Commons agreed to clear the prince's reaccumulated high debts, which had reached $21 million, almost $22 million in today's money, and to provide additional state funds for his living expenses and the upkeep of his residence. However, during the following year, 1788, the prince's father, George III, began to display signs of a deteriorating mental health and became deranged, although the mad King George would not die until 1820. Nonetheless, in 1811, when George III was deemed incapable of serving any longer as monarch, his son, Prince George, was made Prince Regent. And 4 years later, with the Crown Treasury more fully at his disposal, the Prince Regent commissioned John Nash to transform the Brighton Pavilion into the exotic chinoiserie pleasure palace that's familiar to us today. Prince George had already displayed his cosmopolitan taste, love of visual arts, and fascination with China, that is, the China of England's imagination. He had been gathering furnishings for his seaside villa, including Chinese exports, for furniture and decorative arts, and hand-painted Chinese wallpapers. The major changes to the Royal Pavilion, however, occurred between 1815 and 1823, when John Nash transformed the pavilion both inside and out, creating an exotic oriental palace of exterior onion domes and interior imaginative chinoiserie. In January 1820, when the Prince Regent's Chinese extravaganza is still in progress, George III died, and George IV was crowned in July the following year during a lavish coronation ceremony that again cost £23 million. The spendthrift George IV would reign only 10 years, and during this entire time, he only made 2 visits to the royal pavilion. Spend the money, but don't even go look at it. Now grown obese and suffering from ill health due to his drinking and indulgent lifestyle, George IV died in 1830. His successor enjoyed the pavilion for a while, but Queen Victoria didn't like it. And partly it was because of Brighton's reputation for licentiousness, and so she abandoned it, shipping furniture and fittings to London. When the railroad connected London and Brighton in 1841, the abandoned pavilion was noticed by increasing numbers of Victorian. Brighton grew rapidly around it. It was sold in 1850 to the Brighton Town Council, and today it's open to the public and has been described as one of the most dazzling and exotic buildings in the British Isle. Now, I mentioned that particularly because that is literally a contemporary of Biddulph. I mean, this is the finishing of this and the turning over by 1850 when it was sold to the town of Brighton and became a popular visitation for Englishmen is about the time that Biddulph was begun. So English contact with China was largely secondhand through the 18th and 19th century, relying on English objects, Chinese objects, and some printed visual materials such as Chambers' design books. And just a few years after the sale of the Brighton Pavilion, Bateman was prompted to dedicate an area of Biddulph Grange to what he called China, planting there a golden larch, one of the oldest surviving in the country, purple-leaved Japanese maples, Japanese cedars, and tree peonies. Intent on creating his own China in miniature, Bateman added to his arbor setting a humpback and zigzag bridge, a Chinese temple, a joss house, sculpture, and a great wall with a watchtower. The most likely inspiration for it all was neither his own travels, any personal direct contact with China, nor that of some commissioned surrogate, nor indeed is Biddulph's China a manifestation of any imperialist view or political agenda. Some have even argued that it's based on a Spode dinner plate. Bateman's admiration of the blue willow pattern plate, which remains almost universally familiar today, was translated at Biddulph to Bateman's personal China. The oriental scene of the blue willow chinaware depicts a flared roof Chinese pavilion or pagoda, a waterside bridge with 3 figures, a figure on a boat, 2 flying birds, and a willow tree, all arranged in an irregular landscape. Scholar Patricia O'Hara has observed that by the mid-19th century, blue willow was firmly installed in Victorian households. It is likely James Bateman saw the blue willow pattern chinaware displayed at the Great Exhibition in London, perhaps in the same manner akin to that has been described in Francis Talfourd's The Mandarin's Daughter, published in 1851, which I quote here. So, of course, when I heard of your great exhibition, I was speedily found in a state of transition. On my dragon, I came out, conceived my surprise round a public house kitchen, when casting my eyes, I saw upon a table, stand, dresser, and shelf in earthenware, china, stone hardware, and delft, drawn long ways and short ways, drawn outside and in on plate, cup and saucer, dish, basin, tureen, a picture which is but a full illustration of an olden love story, well known in my nation, but still more my surprise on eclipsing my pleasure at finding the English so ready to treasure the legends of China, to find that unknown was a story from which all the picture had grown. And when I told the story, they said, "You be blowed, that's the old willow pattern of Copeland and Spode." Well, the specific willow pattern design is thought to be an early 1780s creation of Thomas Minton for the Thomas Turner's factory at Shropshire. Minton then moved the Spode factory to Staffordshire, the county where Biddulph Grange is sited. Spode started further popularizing the design. The Blue Willow pattern's architecture is thought to be based on a tea house and waterside setting in the Shanghai garden known as Yu Yuan, while the scene at large references a fairy tale about two thwarted lovers. Admired by Bateman, the Blue Willow plate quite likely inspired his waterside zigzag bridge, his China temple with corridor surrounding plantings in the section that he called China. And as will be discussed below, these Chinese elements were not isolated objects in an open landscape with no other Asian context as they were at Stowe or at Shugborough, but rather coordinated in a garden setting where architecture and plants and trees and a stumpery and gates and walls and sculpture formed a coordinated ensemble, a virtual set piece distinguished from other areas of the garden and forming a three-dimensional picture which he called China. Now let's do the same thing with Egypt. Reflecting international interest among 19th century Englishmen, Biddulph's China was not the only example of the world image fascination. As remote in time and geography as the Orient, Egypt had been a relatively unknown until the turn of the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte's military exploits in Egypt from 1798 to 1801 and his documenting and plundering of Egyptian artifacts encouraged the curiosity about ancient Egypt, akin to that of distant China, with the added relevance that ancient Egypt, especially Ptolemaic Egypt, provided a popular extension of the Roman neoclassicism informing the long Hanoverian age. In an emerging Romantic age, turn of the 19th century architects and their clients sought out ever wider ancient sources for the styling of their buildings, beyond the measured Roman classicism of Andrea Palladio and the English Anglo-Palladians. The novel Neo-Pompeian decorative interior designs of Robert Adam and others, which are often misrepresented as Etruscan, gave rise to the eclectic neoclassicism of Thomas Hope, who looked to both Rome and Egypt for inspiration in his Regency revivalist furniture and decorative arts. And when Napoleon's 1798 scientific expedition in Egypt was published in multiple volumes between 1809 and 1828 under the title Description de l'Égypte, the Egyptian revival found new vigor. Napoleon's expedition in Egypt was ostensibly a failed military operation intended to protect French trade interests. Anticipating logistical problems resulting from poor roads and a lack of knowledge of Egyptian topography, engineers and surveyors accompanied Napoleon, who instructed them to read and record the various features and characteristics of the Egyptian landscape that the troops occupied and to draw accurate maps of the regions they visited. Also included in the French leader's Egyptian exhibition was a contingent of 167 scientists and scholars, what he called the savants, charged with the task of documenting their observations in other fields in Egypt. Naturalists and biologists studied Egyptian flora and fauna, and the artist Henri Joseph Redoute drew every species of flower and plant that the expedition discovered. The engineers Prosper Jorlois and Edouard de Volière executed technical drawings of the monuments at Luxor, at Dondera, Karnak, Edfu, Philae, and various other sites, while the archaeologists studied the country's mysterious pyramids and recorded wall reliefs and hieroglyphs from temples and tombs along the Nile. Early in the expedition, French soldiers found the famous Rosetta Stone. And when the Frenchman Jean-François Champignon studied and compared the three languages of the stone's script, the Demotic, hieroglyphic, and Greek, it enabled him to translate the hieroglyphics on it, and new doors to scholarly activity and knowledge of ancient Egypt were open. Comparable in England to the notable French publication of images of ancient Egypt is the publication between 1842 and 1849, right on the eve of Biddulph, of portfolios of lithographs by Louis Haig based on drawings of David Roberts entitled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land. This was the subject of our massive Egyptian lecture of some months ago. The series of portfolios published fully rendered views painted by Roberts based on his on-site drawings, his sketches, and nearly 300 studies made during his 1838 to 39 trip to Egypt and the Holy Land. He was a Scottish painter and a member of the Royal Academy, also painted oils. He was one of the first Englishmen to study and record views of Egypt. And these caused a sensation in England, appearing in separate volumes, the lithographs in the 1840s, at the very moment James Bateman first met Edward Cook, with whom he would collaborate on the gardens at Biddulph. Edward Cook was familiar with David Roberts and his images of Egypt. Indeed, according to Campbell Price, curator of Egypt and the Sudan at the Manchester Museum, quote, Edward Cook is known to have visited Egypt himself, although this is highly open to debate. In September 1849, Cook, already known for his knowledge of plants and design talents in the garden, was invited to Biddulph and saw for the first time the grounds that he and Bateman would develop to be one of the most noteworthy world image gardens of the 19th century. And as we'll note below, Cook's influence on Bateman went beyond the general design of Biddulph Grange Garden and its discrete areas of China and Egypt, or even advising him on selection of plants and ferns. Cook was very interested in the history of ferns. Cook is also credited with the architectural design of the garden buildings at Biddulph. Well, at Biddulph Grange's topiary pyramid, capping an Egyptian gate with cavetto cornice and flanking sphinxes, that view on the left on the screen is from Biddulph, an unusual hybrid of architecture, sculpture, and formal clipped hedges. However, the appearance of Egyptian forms in English gardens did not begin at Biddulph, and as we noted with the antecedent interests in China and chinoiserie, there are roots to the 19th century interest in Egypt. One of Britain's earliest employments of sphinxes as a decorative feature, example, goes back to the 17th century in a sundial in an abbey in Scotland. In the 1730s, Lord Burlington and William Kent ornamented the garden of Burlington's villa at Chiswick with sphinxes. A pair are visible today on the stone gate piers that animate the forecourt at Chiswick. And obelisks and pyramids and other Egyptian forms in Britain would follow. Obelisks became a popular form of classical monument in England even prior to David Roberts' lithographic views of Egypt and predating Napoleon's Egyptian campaign as well. They appear, oddly enough, in Inigo Jones' New West Front, added before the Great Fire to St. Paul's Cathedral in 1630, has obelisks on the front of it. Remarkably, a genuine Egyptian obelisk from the east pylon of the Temple of Isis at Philae was acquired in Egypt by William Banks in 1815, who, with the assistance of the archaeologist Belzoni, transported the obelisks and a large piece of stone broken off of its twin to London in 1821, and later, as we see here, to his estate at Kingston Lacy in Dorset. The obelisk was installed in Banks' garden in 1830, with the fragment set up as a romantic fragment ruin nearby. The 131 to 117 BC Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions on the intact obelisk and fragments interested Banks as a possible aid to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The other obelisk of the pair at Philae had toppled over and had been broken to pieces in antiquity. So in addition to Kingston Lacy and its obelisk from Philae, other genuine Egyptian obelisks were transported out of Egypt during the 19th century. Most famous, the so-called Cleopatra Needle, a pair of obelisks originally made in Cairo during the New Kingdom and inscribed by the 18th century dynasty Thutmose III and the 19th century Pharaoh Ramses II. Both were moved to Alexandria, where they were named for the Ptolemaic Queen Cleopatra, hence they were both called Cleopatra's Needle, and that's where David Roberts saw them when he went to Egypt in Alexandria. One of the Egyptian obelisks was presented to Great Britain in 1819 and not moved to London until 1877. The Alexandria Alexandria obelisk was erected on London's Victoria Embankment the following year. Also in 1878, the second New Kingdom obelisk was transported to New York and re-erected in Central Park outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Roberts recorded them, however, in 1838, still in situ in Alexandria, one partially buried in sand and the second toppled over. Well, more famous of any of these Egyptian obelisks, perhaps, is the pair of 227-ton Luxor obelisks rising 75.5 feet and dedicated to Ramses II, originally flanking the monumental New Kingdom temple in Luxor, dedicated to the Theban triad. The obelisks were given in 1831 to the French government by the Viceroy of Egypt in gratitude for Jean-Francois Chaupignon's work in translating hieroglyphics. One of the obelisks was transported at great difficulty to Paris, and it was re-erected in the Place de la Concorde, where the guillotine once stood during the Reign of Terror, and before that, an equestrian statue of Louis XV. In October 1836, the Luxor obelisk was finally lifted into place in Paris, 1836, just before Bateman. The whole ordeal was so difficult that France never undertook transporting the second Luxor obelisk, which still is in Luxor. And in 1981, French President Francois Mitterrand officially returned the second Luxor obelisk to Egypt. He gave it back, but they never got it, where it remains as built at the Luxor temple. Well, now obelisks could be moved as well as inspired revivalist English replicas. Ancient pyramids could not only be copied at vastly reduced scale. And nevertheless, Egyptian pyramids were a popular revivalist form in the age of historicism. In fact, the 18th century, the term obelisk and pyramid were synonymous. And the late 18th century pyramidal entry gate at Nostell Priory in Yorkshire is known as the Obelisk Lodge. It was designed by Robert Adam as a gateway, and it was actually accommodated. It was large enough that the gatekeeper could live in there with his family. 50 years before Adam's Nostell Priory pyramidal obelisk lodge, England witnessed a flurry of pyramid construction in gardens of the 1720s. The earliest was John Vanbrook's massive pyramid gate, serving as an entrance to Castle Howard. His normal, weighty architecture is no better demonstrated than in his fortress walls and powerful pyramidal gate on the Yorkshire estate. When Vanbrook died in 1726, Lord Cobham at Stowe erected a 60-foot-high, steeply stepped pyramid, earlier designed by Vanbrook as a memorial to the architect. This is on the bottom left, just shown in a drawing. The Latin inscription is translated to the memory of Sir John Vanbrook, by whom several of the buildings on these gardens were designed. Lord Cobham hath erected this pyramid. And for 71 years, that pyramid stood in the northwest corner of Stowe's western garden along the drive just below the boycott pavilions, but they were taken down. The pyramid was lost and demolished in 1797. But contemporary with by the way, I talked about Vanbrook's weighty architecture. I should mention that when Vanbrook died, some wag decided that his epitaph should be, "Lie heavy on the earth, for he has laid heavy a load on thee." And so he was always highly substantial and weighty in his designs. Well, here's another odd pyramid with an ogee arch penetrating it called Needle's Eye in Wentworth Woodhouse from the 1720s, and then Hawksmoor's Great Pyramid, which was a monument dedicated to Lord Howard, William Howard, who was the founder of the Carlisle branch of the Howard family who built Castle Howard. And if we return to Russia, we find primary to Cameron's arrival a notable instance of an Egyptian revival at Tsarkayo Selo. This was erected between 1752 and 1754 during the reign of Empress Elizabeth, who was a daughter of Peter the Great and who reigned up until 62. At the palace, as the palace shows, Elizabeth favored the Baroque style, and Bartolome Rastrelli, who remodeled it as we know it today, was Catherine's favorite architect. But Rastrelli, like so many architects in an eclectic age, could adopt other styles and did so, presumably with Catherine's approval, at the gates leading into the Tsar's village. These gates are styled in the Egyptian revival with canted walls like great pylons in ancient Egypt temples and surfaces covered with linear incisions. If we go back to England, we see a host of Egyptian revival in early 19th century architecture in England. The Regency-style William Bullock Museum, known as either the London Museum or sometimes the Egyptian Museum, is based on some of the information that came out of Belzoni's writings about Egypt after he returned to England in 1819. Egyptian revival architecture continued to appear during Queen Victoria's early reign, including the Egyptian house at Penzance, which is on the bottom left, the synagogue at King Street, the top right, and then the Masonic Lodge in Boston, Lincolnshire, the bottom right. Obelisks, pyramids, sphinxes appear in English garden town squares as monuments and in front of public buildings, and Egyptian forms and motifs, especially marked tombs and entry gates into cemeteries. And these were found in the 18th and the 19th century. Now, mid-19th century English interest in things Egyptian at the eve of Biddulph may best be seen in cemetery design, recognizing that cemetery parks were themselves public gardens, hosting perambulations, picnics, and other recreational activities. Here's a quick view of the Highgate entry with Egyptian Revival Gateway. It was illustrated in the Penny Magazine of the Society of the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in 1839. And beyond the gate on either side of the avenue were 16 vaults, each one fitted for 12 coffins. That Egyptian avenue led to a circle of Lebanon, whose inner vaults were also Egyptian Revival. So this was predominantly Egyptian Revival enterprise. And so it's no surprise that the worldview that informed England's decorative arts and architecture for several generations before Biddulph extended from China to Egypt, although it would reach into one of the notable gardens of the mid-century. There was a prominent publication of the mid-century that called the Palace of Architecture, which envisioned a complex of gardens, and this had some influence, we think, on Bateman. It was to include a Chinese garden with an artificial rockwork and an Egyptian garden with sphinxes and obelisks, and these cultures were clearly in the national consciousness. James Bateman moved to Biddulph Grange around 1840, and by 1842 he was ordering plants for the gardens. In 1849, he brought Edward Cook there to inspect the gardens, and their remarkable and productive collaboration began. And in addition to planting trees and plants and ferns from around the globe, Bateman and Cook soon began to incorporate in the world image garden these architectural features from both China and Egypt. So we can move to the creation of Biddulph Grange and our armchair tour. James Bateman's interest in geology and botany informed his work at Biddulph Grange, and he had already gained an expertise in the cultivation of orchids when he began to develop his gardens. He published a book on the orchids of Mexico and Guatemala in 6 parts from 1837 to 43, the last appearing soon after he moved to Biddulph Grange. The house at Biddulph Grange had been a vicarage. It was possibly part of a Cistercian abbey. His uncle was the vicar and moved to a nearby house about 1841. Bateman was free to expand the vicar's residence, and he served as his own architect, assisted by Cook, for the development of an Italianate house whose design may have been influenced by Prince Albert's Osborne house on the Isle of Wight. He began to collect antiquities from Rome, Central America, and India for the museum he developed inside the house, displaying hummingbirds from Guatemala, and especially a very interesting geological gallery illustrating what he called the great geological facts of the globe. The landscape gardener Edward Kemp, who wrote a series of articles on Biddulph in the Garden Chronicle, described the geological gallery as follows. On the one side, at about 3 feet from the ground, a series of specimens showing the Earth's formation and exhibiting all the various strata in their natural succession are let into the wall in a layer about 18 inches wide, and above this are arranged the animal and vegetable fossils that the respective strata yield. Many rare and elegant examples are here brought together, and as the once living organisms are placed exactly above the strata from which their remains were taken, the series constitutes at once the most simple and most complete lessons in practical geology that could be imagined. This was created in 1858 and opened in 1862 as an exhibit of geological history. And it's interesting that it is coterminous with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, to which it poses a counter-argument regarding creation. Williams suggests the timeline is inspired by the work of geologist and theology Hugh Miller, who attempted to specifically tie the geological record of each day of creation outlined in the Bible with each day comprising an epic of geological history. So the fossils and the collections are all sort of part of a counter-argument to the origin of the species. Bateman's partner in designing the grounds of his new estate was Edward Cook. He first arrived at Staffordshire property in September of 1849, and he stayed a week the first time. But over the next 17 years, Cook visited Biddulph 15 times, hosted Bateman in his London home, and they met together at the Athenaeum in London, where they were both members. And they talked about the design, and ultimately Cook helped create the terraces, the geometric gardens near the house, and transform the hillside grounds into these informal enclosures with different types of plantings, as we've suggested. In 1865, Bateman intended to leave Biddulph Grange to his son John, who married that year, but who soon announced he wanted to sell the estate and move elsewhere. There were £35,000 worth of mortgages on the property, and by the late 1860s, the younger Bateman was ready to abandon the house and its gardens. Although Biddulph Grange failed to sell at auction in 1871, it was finally purchased by an industrialist who lived there till about 1891. And by that time, of course, Edward Cook was also gone. And it was at this point that the house was converted to a hospital, and the grounds were just simply left to ruin. Forward a little bit, the closest of these worldview gardens to Biddulph is just also in Staffordshire at Alton Towers, and I show a Chinese pagoda there among the various things that are set there. And one other case which I just wanted to mention, which is a background kind of world image garden in a similar way, is the garden in the Jardin de Monceau in Paris for an Anglophile Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, who became the Duc d'Orléans in 1785, and that's on the top left, where he's built a pyramid in his garden as well. He became Duc d'Orléans just before he met his death by the guillotine, the same year he had voted to execute Louis XVI. Louis-Philippe was also the Duc de Chartres, and the garden pavilions, whose myriad evocations of small constructions representing these false vestiges, the other garden adornments that he built after 1778 were so varied and outlandish, they soon caused the place to be nicknamed Chartres' Folly, or the madness of the Duke of Orleans. The landscape accoutrements included, if you can think of all this in the Parc Monceau, a ruined Temple of Mars, a farmhouse, a small Egyptian pyramid, which we're looking at, a Roman colonnade, antique statues, a Dutch windmill, medieval ruins, a Chinese entry gate and bridge, an Italian vineyard, a Turkish pavilion, 2 Turkish tents, a Tartar tent, and a minaret with servants dressed as Tartars and Hindus required to lead animals brought from Africa and Asia. Well, the head gardener was a Scot, and the plants came from a nursery in Hammersmith, but this was a French example of And I compare it, by the way, to pyramids that Empress Catherine placed in her garden in St. Petersburg. The one distinction, which obviously makes it almost ironical, is that for most of the year, the pyramids, unlike those in Egypt, are covered with snow. So James Bateman may have known some of these world image gardens, but Peter Hayden suggests that it may come from an earlier garden magazine. But I want to just go ahead and move to our armchair tour and show you the garden in full. The house was designed by James Bateman himself, assisted by a draftsman, and we may well take interest in the several ways in which the garden is made a part of the house. A plan of Biddulph House and Garden, published in 1862 in an issue of the Gardener's Chronicle and Architectural Gazette, shows a camellia house off the main corridor near the library. The latter overlooks a steep set of garden stairs with flanking more formal layout of planting area near the house. There's also off the billiard room a rhododendron house, later made into a fern house, whose larger arched windows bring planting visually right into the interior of the house itself. And the dining room opens into a court, and on the first floor, a conservatory and orangery help link the house and the garden. Most notable, perhaps, are the terraces overlooking the main garden, and the tendency to use parterres and more architectonic garden features, walls and balustrades and urns on plinths, and even a parterre with clipped border hedges, all these very close to the house. From the upper terraces, paths lead to more informal, picturesque, and exotic, even hidden parts of the extended garden below. Since the opening of the garden by the National Trust, visitors pass through the west end of the house to enter the garden from the library. The Italian region of Biddulph here presents itself with a formal staircase and orderly geometric beds flanking the axis, a line of garden hardscape which immediately opens to an informal landscape down below. Although the lake and the color of azaleas and rhododendrons beckon from below, one cannot help but note that all along the extended breadth of the garden face of the country house, terraces and enclosed courts are held close to the house. From the oak drawing room, an upper terrace extends along the closed walls of service rooms, leads through a tunnel into a projecting boudoir to a parterre beyond, and from there the garden draws one up steps and through an arboretum to a monumental axis of the Wellatonia Avenue and a huge stone urn way at the end of it. Below the surface wings and terraces, Mrs. Bateman's garden nestles privately and undisturbed, and lower still is the so-called Dahlia Walk. It's enclosed and compartmentalized in yew hedges. The Dahlia Walk leads along a stepped path toward an Italianate tower with Romanesque arches and a lookout terrace rooftop. These more formally organized garden rooms are more secluded, but terraces and overlooks provide views of the main garden below. Prominent, of course, is the lake, covered with water lilies in August and with its island and borders adorned with azaleas and rhododendrons, which bring bright color to the garden in this area in May. Joseph Hooker at Kew, returning from his world travels, published his book on rhododendrons and introduced many of the species he wrote about to the European gardens, including at Biddulph. Bateman took great care in providing the best soil and proper environment, with concern for exposure and wind protection, in order to raise the variety of rhododendrons that he exhibited at Biddulph, many of these from the Americas. Rock outcroppings added rugged natural features to this and other sections of the garden. From the rhododendron ground, a tunnel leads to the pinetum, a feature designed by Edward Cook and containing a mix of conifers and oaks, various thorns and gorse intermixed, in effect, color, tone, shape, and background that only the most consummate taste and love of arboriculture could be capable of, as a catalog said in 1871, producing a result that has hitherto been unmatched. Heather-covered mounds that with special species that were planted for show, golden hollies and golden yews served as foils for monkeys monkey puzzles and deodars, dark yews, and hollies, all background for lighter greens. Junipers flanking the Cheshire cottage that Edward Kemp described as a green fountain. Edward Kemp was author of How to Lay Out a Garden and advised that if stones were unavailable or less desirable, good effect could be achieved by composing rugged stumps or roots of old trees, most certainly an echo of what advocates of the picturesque movement once called ruins of a natural kind. In the garden section, China, moreover, the convoluted irregularities and perforations of a stumpery, the first in England, would substitute at Biddulph for a rockery, recalling, here's a rockery in Suzhou, China, which is what they were kind of emulating with these stumperies, recalling rockeries that were pretty ubiquitous in traditional Chinese gardens, often single or grouped conglomerates of Taihu rocks that have been lake washed over millennia almost, certainly over many, many years, and were perceived in these gardens as miniature mountains. These lake-washed stones dragged from Lake Taihu after centuries of shaping by water and time were admired in China for their perforations, their outline distortions, and general interplay of solid and void. An organic and time-imbued form of a giant oak group was admired for the very same thing. They were trying to emulate what the Chinese did in stone. So they would cluster together in a stumpery, conjured similar aesthetic and philosophical response to the garden, for the garden visitor at Biddulph. And in localities where stone is not easily procured, Kemp wrote, or where it bounds so much that the use of another material would be preferred for the sake of variety, the rugged stumps or roots of old trees may be substituted and will yield quite as much picturesqueness. That, by the way, I'm showing on the top right a figure to get a sense of the scale of these things. These are not just, up to your knees, but they're pretty substantial stumperies. Garden historian Brent Elliott has noted that the rootery had been emphasized in the literature on Chinese gardens from Chambers on. And Stewart observes, however, that the rootery never caught the public imagination in the way its stony cousin did, certainly in China, but acknowledged that Biddulph Grange features a rare and grand example. Bateman built a stumpery at Biddulph by the approach to China from the eastern terrace, piling and securing tree stumps until they met, arched in places 10 or 12 feet overhead. On a steep bank in the rhododendron ground, Kemp noted Bateman's just disregard for petty criticism, where he planted dead trees upside down. I never could find the upside down trees at Biddulph, but here's an example at another garden. Literally trees put upside down, and then these other vines, ferns, or plants would be planted in their roots at the top. At the far end of the Pinetum is the Cheshire Cottage, a surprise focal ornament whose unexpected role as entry or exit gate into or from Egypt reflects the eclecticism of the garden. If you walk through that door, through a kind of cave, you come out in the section called Egypt. The cottage displays the dates 1856 and the initials JB and MB for James and Maria Bateman. The cottage is intended to evoke picturesque forms of traditional vernacular architecture in Western England and calls to mind the kind of rustic cottage design that Marie Antoinette had at her hameau, or that we saw earlier at Stourhead. Of course, the other end of that cottage, if you pass into the cottage and out the cave on the other side, you arrive at Egypt. The entry door is crowned. This is, if you were going back the other way, you'd go through the Cavetto molding there. The entry door is crowned with a Cavetto molding with winged scarab. Two sphinxes designed by Hawkins flank the entry axis, marking the court of hedges known simply as Egypt. The entry door leads to a tunnel, inside of which is a monstrous stone representative of the ape of Thoth, reminding us that the god of Thoth, according to the Egyptians, invented botany. From its inner sanctum, light pulls the visitor toward an opening, and one exits into the Pinetum. And if you turn around, you would see the cottage Cheshire Cottage marking the other entry to the sanctuary. The Pinetum makes a long sweep around the southeastern section of the garden. Its avenue between raised mounds displays pines and firs. It's one of the most open and enlarged scale areas of Biddulph's landscape. Curiously, the linear Pinetum is accessed at both ends by mysterious tunnels, the one leading from the Egyptian court through the Cheshire Cottage and the other exiting the rhododendron ground via another tunnel through a natural rock opening that was designed by Edward Cook. Near this second tunnel is a path leading northeast to a glen and a third tunnel. This was called the Himalayan Glen, also designed by Cook. It's a superb natural composition of rocks and ferns and moss. And it's not frequently that you find rocks in these gardens treated the same way, and I don't have time to kind of mention a few others that are there, but they sometimes were formed, in actual shape to create a great wall leading to China or a gate leading into the final area of the World Image Garden. From the glen, an opening in the rock leads to a subterranean passage and grottos which open to a terrace overlooking the Chinese waters. This is the water source for the rivulet through the glen, but is much more. We are now in another world. We have entered China. Biddulph's world of China culminates over a century of English interest in adopting Chinese features in garden design, beginning, as we noted, in Stowe's 1738 China house. Architecturally, Biddulph's China reflects the fashion for Chinese buildings spreading through Europe from Stowe to Kew to the Jardin de Monceau to Zarkayo Salo near St. Petersburg. At Biddulph, the Chinese temple and gallery overlooking the bridge and the pond were designed by Edward Cook and included traditional upward flaring pagoda-type roof lines, delicate wood carvings serving to frame views of the garden, and a delicate humped-back bridge with bells and other adornments. A jagged path and steps lead up to this Joss house. They're enriched by horticultural variety of contrasting color and texture. Throughout the China section of the garden, dragons, a stone frog, and likely the stone grebes were all worked by Waterhouse Hawkins, the sculptor who provided prehistoric animals for Paxton's Crystal Palace Park at Sydenham. Lions and sundry Chinese monstrosities are at Biddulph. Finally, in addition to Oriental architecture and sculpture, the plants on display here were Chinese species collected by world travelers such as Robert Fortune, who brought the golden larch from China in a Wardian case. Bateman planted 2, and the surviving Gordon larch at Biddulph, displaying its yellow hues at its peak for a week each year, may be the oldest in cultivation. The use of variegated bamboo, Japanese maples, Mouton peonies, and rhododendron brought an impressive array of color and form throughout the China section of Biddulph. Nothing, perhaps, surpasses the effect of light behind leaves of a Japanese maple, which Bateman described in a lecture to the Royal Horticultural Society, quote, shine with a brilliant metallic reddish copper transparency that cannot be described. One is unaware as one passes the Chinese pool and then through the Chinese gates and sees the so-called high cliffs, the walls of China, and a watchtower enclosing on our left flank, that just beyond these picturesque features lies the formality of the Dahlia Walk, hidden just on the other side. Similarly, as one passes another stretch of the China Wall high above a path along the east edge of the China region, one may not realize that the masses of evergreens overlooking the China Wall are part of the Pinetum beyond. It's an intricate interplay of these regions. Each region of Biddulph is its own world. And if David Stewart concluded that in this garden the passion for garden features reached excess, I would substitute the word sophistication. The garden is an elaborate Chinese puzzle comprised of pieces of distinct character and interlocked in ingenious ways. Biddulph brought the world to Staffordshire. piece by piece, indeed collected plant by plant, in a display of architecture and horticulture that embodied the global view of its owner and its time, whether in Italian terraces, in Egyptian pyramids and pylons of topiary, or in a region called simply China. The World Image Garden at Biddulph Grange embodied in microcosm an expanding English world on which the sun never set. Thank you. Sorry to be a bit long. That's just a lot to look at and a lot to cover, but I hope you enjoyed the travelogue. Now, who's going to go to Biddulph next time they go to England? Very good. Yeah, there. Got it on your list?
Moving stuff, but thank you so
Yes,
much.
indeed. Sorry that was so long. There was just so much to kind of float around. I'll have to find a way to do this in 2 parts sometime. Sort of like the Egyptian when we had an intermission, but everybody knew we were going to be an hour and a half or 2 hours on that one. So,
Well, I think everyone really enjoyed it.
good.
Thank you so much, Bob. It was wonderful.
Well, good.
Thank you again.
Hope I didn't wear you out.
Fascinating.
Well, it's a great place to look
Yeah,
at.
it looks like it.
Very-
Linda might give you a call or email or something and get a few opinions about which gardens we should see the most and when we're down there.
Well,
We know some of the major ones.
a lot of it depends on what you like and where you're going to be. I mean,
What's the name of the town? Chipping Campbell?
Yeah, so we're going to be in the Cotswolds for about a week.
well, Hidcote is literally
Yeah,
2 or
it's-
3 miles north
It's
of
right
Chipping Campbell.
there.
It is
Yeah.
Okay.
right there.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
We'll
That's
definitely
early
see
20th
that.
century and a very small one.
Okay.
Sissinghurst is in Kent outside of London,
Okay.
but not maybe where you're going to be. Hestercombe is south, almost into Cornwall. It's down near Taunton,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
the
another.
one I mentioned to you. the other day.
That's a great one for luncheons, and
I'd love to see.
it's in Staffordshire, which is it's middle-ish.
Okay.
The big, the classic 18th century ones are Stourhead and Stowe. And Stourhead is down near Wells, in that sort of southern Cotswolds, and Stowe is in Buckinghamshire, sort of not that far out of London. So they're all over the place. I mean,
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
really,
Well, we're
you have
gonna
to get a
try-
car and spend 2 weeks.
That's right.
Exactly.
We're going to
That's
track it all
right.
down.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad you made it. How was Sea Island? It was great. We had a good time down there. Yeah. We're off with our friends to the same old Iris thing. If you want to come, or if I know you've had a long drive, so you want to get unloaded. We got here with about a minute to spare. I saw you come in. Well, I was telling the person who was getting started this about 2 minutes early. I said, "Don't start. I want to wait 2 or 3 minutes. There's a friend coming from Sea Island to this." So, and I saw you in the hallway, and I figured, well, Robin is on her way.
That
was enjoyable.
Yeah.
Well, good. I hope it wasn't too long. I think it was too long. I never can gauge these things, but there was just so much to, give as background that it was kind of fun to put it in a larger context.
Well, you had me study we studied Biddulph Grange before I went to the Victorian Society school.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of good memories.
So you knew what you were going to see.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. We met the Maoris in Russia, and the 2 or 3 of the things that were from Catherine's palace that I showed were when we were together in Russia. And the one, I'm sure they're going to. The Chinese village is taken online. I didn't see that, but I knew it was there.
Yeah.
But the Chinese gates, or the Egyptian gates going into that whole complex, that was one of those things where I literally was in the bus, and the bus was flying to go to Catherine's palace, and I look ahead and I see these things, and I said, "Whoa!" And I'm taking the photograph from the bus as it's flying by, and I've got 2 or 3 that worked,
Yeah.
So I was able to include that, but
more than that. Thank you, it's great.
Yes,
Enjoy
indeed.
it.
Good,
See you
good,
guys
good.
around.
We'll see you.
See you next time. Oh, Robin, by the way, we just had the lighting company come and light the pergola and light the house and the whole bit.
I can't wait to see it.
So we got night lighting on it now.
That's
Can't
very
wait to see it.
Yeah, yeah.